The roses from my son's funeral were still fresh when she showed up on my doorstep. Black dress, sunglasses, and a man's arm draped casually around her waist. The sun was setting behind them, warm and cruel, lighting up the for sale sign she'd planted in my yard. If you've ever trusted someone who turned out colder than you imagined, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because I've learned betrayal doesn't always wear a stranger's face. I remember how her perfume mixed with the scent of lilies, how her words cut through the quiet like glass. That was the moment I realized grief wasn't the only thing I'd have to survive. Let me show you how it all began. It was 2:30 p.m. on a gray Ohio afternoon when I buried my only son. The air felt heavy, still, like even the sky didn't dare move. Daniel's name was carved into the stone in front of me, and as the preacher spoke, I barely heard a word. My hands were clasped so tight they ached, but I didn't loosen them. Sometimes, holding pain in place is the only way to keep from falling apart. Daniel had been my whole world. My boy who used to call every Sunday, who brought me flowers for no reason, who made sure I never felt alone after his father passed. When the casket lowered, it was like the sound of the earth closing over both of us. I remember thinking there was nothing left for me to lose. I was wrong, because just hours later, while the food from the funeral still sat untouched on the kitchen counter, Brittany walked into Daniel's house, the house he built for his family and told me would always be my home. She wasn't alone. A man followed behind her, his arm resting too comfortably around her shoulders. She smiled like she was walking into a party, not her husband's mother's grief. I stood there, still in black, when she told me I needed to pack my things and leave. She said the house wasn't mine anymore. Her voice was cold, detached, like I was nothing but clutter to be cleared away. Grief turned sharp in my chest then. I remember every detail, the smell of lilies, the weight of silence after her words, the steady thud of my own heartbeat. They thought I would crumble. They thought loss made me weak. But they were wrong. I just needed to remember how it all began. It was a December evening, the kind that smelled like pine and snow. When Daniel told me he had something to show me, I still remember the glow from the streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement, how his breath hung in the air as he grinned, eyes sparkling like the boy he used to be. My son had grown into a man with a steady job, a family, and a kind heart that never hardened. I thought that was enough to make me proud. I had no idea what he was about to do. He pulled up to a small house in Maplewood, a white 2-story with blue shutters and a wraparound porch. It looked like something out of a dream, the kind of home I used to imagine when I worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. Daniel told me it was mine. He said he wanted me to have a place where I could rest, where I didn't have to worry anymore. I didn't know what to say. I had spent years raising him alone after his father died, patching our life together with borrowed strength. I'd sold my wedding ring to pay for his college books, skipped meals so he could eat better, and now, standing there with snow falling soft around us, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. Inside, the house smelled like new paint and promise. I ran my hand along the stair rail, the wood smooth under my fingers. Daniel stood beside me, proud and nervous, waiting for my reaction. All I could do was hold him, whispering thanks in my heart for every good thing that led to that moment. But I remember Brittany, standing near the doorway. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her arms were folded, and her voice was thin when she said it was a beautiful home. There was something in her tone, something cold, like she wasn't seeing a gift, but a threat. I brushed it off, thinking I was reading too much into it. Now, looking back, I know that night wasn't just the start of a new chapter. It was the first crack in the story I thought I knew. If I'd looked closer, I might have seen the darkness waiting behind the warmth. It was just past midnight when the phone rang. I remember the sound more than the words, a sharp, hollow noise that broke through the stillness of my house. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm, saying there had been an accident. My son's name, Daniel, was spoken like a fact, not a life. For a moment, everything in me went quiet. The clock kept ticking. The refrigerator hummed, and I just sat there, waiting for someone to tell me it wasn't true. The drive to the hospital felt endless. The roads blurred, and my hands shook on the wheel. I remember thinking how Daniel always told me not to drive when I was tired. He was careful like that. He followed rules, checked the weather before leaving town, wore his seatbelt even for short trips. When they said he lost control of the car, I couldn't make sense of it. It didn't sound like my boy. The morgue was colder than I expected. The lights were too bright, white against steel. When they pulled back the sheet, my knees nearly gave out. He looked peaceful, too peaceful. No cuts, no bruises, just a stillness that didn't belong to him. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out, just air and silence. Brittany showed up not long after. Her face was pale, but her eyes, there was something missing there. No tears, no trembling. She told me he must have been tired, that these things happen. She spoke like she was reading a line she'd rehearsed too many times. And when she touched my arm, her hand was cold. At the funeral, she played the grieving widow well. People comforted her while I sat alone, watching the line of cars move through the cemetery. That's when I noticed a man standing by the fence. He wasn't with anyone, didn't look at the grave, just stared at us, at her. When I turned to ask who he was gone. After everyone left, I stayed by Daniel's grave, the soil still fresh. I thought about the reports, the missing skid marks, the way Brittany avoided my eyes when I asked questions. Grief can blur truth, but it can also sharpen it. Something about this didn't add up. The morning after the funeral, the house felt like it was holding its breath. The flowers were already wilting, their scent turning bitter in the still air. Every corner of that home Daniel had given me felt empty now, as if his laughter had been pulled out of the walls. I sat at the kitchen table, still in the same black dress, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. Then came the sound of tires on the driveway. I looked out the window and saw Brittany's car. She wasn't alone. A man stepped out beside her, tall, confident, with that careless ease of someone who didn't belong in a house built from love and sacrifice. Brittany walked in like she owned the place. Her perfume hit before her words did, all sweetness on the surface, rot underneath. She spoke softly at first, saying she just wanted to clear a few things. What followed was worse than any scream could have been. She told me Daniel had changed his mind before he died, that he regretted putting the house in my name. She said it belonged to her now, that I should start packing. Her tone never cracked. Not once. And when that man, Rick, placed his hand on her back like she was something to protect. I felt the room tilt. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. My grief turned to something colder, something that steadied me. I looked at her and realized I'd never really known the woman my son had married. Her tears at the funeral were rehearsed. Her smile now was real. I told her I understood. I watched her leave, that man's arm still around her shoulders, and I sat back down at the table. The air was quiet again, but not empty anymore. They thought I was defeated. They mistook silence for surrender. I let them think they'd won, but I wasn't done yet. I packed my things in silence. Each box felt heavier than it should have, filled not just with clothes and dishes, but with the echoes of my son's laughter. Every nail hole on the wall marked another memory I couldn't take with me. When I closed the front door of that house, the one Daniel had bought me with pride, I felt something inside me harden. Grief had burned through everything, but what was left behind wasn't emptiness. It was resolve. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about his death was wrong. So, a few days later, I drove to the police station, the same one that had handed me the official report without a trace of empathy. I read it again and again in the parking lot. The words blurred, but the details didn't. Blood alcohol level elevated, prescription sedative detected. That made no sense. Daniel didn't drink. He hated medication unless absolutely necessary. And the crash. No skid marks. No sign he tried to stop. It felt staged, like he had been erased instead of lost. I went back to the crash site. The air still smelled faintly of burnt rubber and rain. There were no flowers there, no marker, nothing to say a life ended on that stretch of road. I stood there and remembered how he'd seemed distracted before he died. Late night calls he wouldn't explain. The way he brushed off my worry with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And Brittany, always hovering, always checking his phone. I thought it was just marital tension. Now I wasn't so sure. When I called the insurance company, they said his life policy had recently been adjusted. Beneficiary changed to Brittany. That was when something inside me clicked. The police weren't going to help. The truth wasn't in their files. That night, I spread Daniel's things across the kitchen table. His keys, his receipts, the fragments of his last days. I told myself I'd find out what really happened, no matter how long it took. They thought I was broken. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Before I left the house, I made sure every corner remembered me, not in pictures or perfume, but in tiny cameras tucked behind vents, inside light fixtures, beneath the kitchen counter. I told myself it was just precaution, something to quiet the unease that never stopped humming inside me. But deep down, I already knew I was setting a trap. The day I handed over the keys, Brittany smiled like victory itself. I thanked her, pretending defeat. Then I drove away and parked a few blocks down, heart steady, eyes on the small tablet in my lap. The cafe I chose was quiet, the kind of place where no one looks twice at an old woman nursing a cup of coffee. The feed flickered to life my living room, my kitchen, the hall where Daniel used to drop his coat. Empty at first. Then, movement. Brittany and Rick walked in laughing. Their voices filled the space that once felt sacred. She kicked off her shoes, threw her purse on the couch, and poured wine. He called her genius. She said something about timing, about how no one suspects a widow. The words slid through the speakers like poison. I froze, barely breathing. Then came the part that shattered the last pieces of doubt. She mentioned the insurance, the sedatives, how he never saw it coming. Rick joked about the crash being too clean. They laughed. My hands shook, but my mind stayed sharp. For a moment, I couldn't move. The cafe noise around me dimmed until all I could hear was the faint hum of the recording. My son's death had been a transaction. My grief, their profit. The tears came, but only once. After that, I watched like a different person, cold, focused, memorizing every detail. When they left the house, I saved the footage, copied it twice, then uploaded it to a drive I kept hidden in my purse. I stared at the reflection in the dark cafe window and didn't recognize my own face. They thought I was powerless, but now I had truth, cold, sharp, and heavy in my hands. The game had changed, and this time I wasn't playing to lose. For a few days after saving the footage, everything felt unnervingly still. I told myself the danger had passed, that they wouldn't suspect anything. But peace has a way of disguising what comes next. It began with something small. The door to my apartment left slightly open when I came home one evening. Nothing missing, nothing broken, just that thin crack of space that said someone had been there. Then came the calls, always from unknown numbers. At first, silence, then breathing. Slow, deliberate. I started unplugging the phone at night, but the sound stayed with me in my dreams. One morning, I found my car tires slashed. I replaced them and kept driving. Fear wanted me cornered, but I refused to stop moving. I began noticing a car parked across the street. Always the same one, the same dented fender. Sometimes its headlights flicked on as I stepped outside. Sometimes it didn't need to. Just knowing it was there was enough. My body stayed tense, alert to every sound. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of the wind through the hallway. I knew it had to be them. Brittany and Rick must have realized the house had been bugged. Maybe they found one of the cameras. Maybe they didn't know how much I'd seen. But the message was clear, they were watching me now. There were moments I wanted to leave everything behind, disappear, let the truth die with me. But that would mean they'd win again. And I wasn't built for surrender. Fear became fuel, sharp and steady. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. So I stopped waiting for them to strike. I decided it was time to turn the tables, time to set my own trap. When fear refused to leave, I learned to invite it in. It became part of the plan. I knew Brittany and Rick wouldn't stop until they felt safe again, until I was gone. So, I gave them what they wanted to hear. I told a few neighbors that I'd destroyed the recordings, that I just wanted peace and to move on. I let the lie travel, knowing it would reach them. Then I waited. My small apartment became a stage. I placed new cameras, one in the clock, another in the lamp, and set a voice recorder under the kitchen table. Every move felt dangerous but necessary. The waiting was worse than fear itself. I barely slept. Every sound outside made my pulse quicken, until, one night, the handle turned. They came quietly at first. I watched from my chair, pretending to be startled when the door opened. Brittany's face was calm, but her eyes betrayed panic. Rick stood behind her, That same smirk he'd worn the day they threw me out of my home. They said I shouldn't have meddled, that accidents could happen again. My heart raced, but I stayed still, letting their words hang in the air. Every second they spoke was another nail in their own coffin. I could almost hear the recorder humming beneath the table. I didn't fight, didn't argue. I just listened, watched them bury themselves in their arrogance. Then came the sound I'd been waiting for, the wail of police sirens cutting through the night. Their faces turned white. I told them, calmly, that the evidence had been in the hands of law enforcement for days. The cameras had already sent everything to cloud storage. They didn't speak after that. The police burst through, lights flashing against the walls that had witnessed too much. I sat in silence as they were led away, wrists bound, voices drowned by the noise. When the door finally closed, I felt nothing like triumph, only a quiet release. The truth had done its work. Justice was slow, but it had arrived, and for the first time since Daniel's death, the silence felt clean again. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls in pulses of chaos. Officers shouted, metal cuffs clicked shut, and Brittany's voice shattered the air. Her calm, polished mask, the one she wore at Daniel's funeral, at my doorstep, at every lie, crumbled in seconds. She screamed that it wasn't true, that she'd been framed, that Rick had done everything. But the truth was louder than her denial now. The truth had weight, and it was dragging her down. Rick stood silent, his face pale and blank. But Brittany fell apart. The woman who once told me to pack my bags now clawed at the officers, her voice cracking, her pride gone. It was over. I stood near the doorway, watching her unravel. I didn't feel joy, not even anger, just a kind of quiet finality. The world had balanced itself, and I was only there to witness it. Grief had burned through me for so long that there was nothing left but ash. And in that ash, a strange peace. As they took her away, I looked toward the sky. The air was cold and clean. For the first time, I could breathe without the weight of unanswered questions pressing against my chest. Justice hadn't brought Daniel back, but it had stopped his memory from being buried beneath their lies. Later, when the last police car disappeared, I sat alone on the steps. The night was still. I closed my eyes and thought of my son, his laugh, his kindness, the way he once told me I'd never be alone. And somehow, I believed him. When I rose to leave, I didn't look back at the flashing lights. The noise, the chaos, the cruelty, it could stay behind. I walked forward, quietly, into what felt like peace. The sky was soft with gold that evening as I stood by Daniel's grave. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying that quiet hum only peace can make. For the first time in years, I wasn't haunted by questions. The truth had surfaced, and with it came silence, the kind that heals instead of hurts. I thought of everything that had happened, the lies, the fear, the endless nights when I wondered if I'd ever feel whole again. Grief had carved me into someone I barely recognized, but it had also revealed what I was made of. Pain taught me how strong love can be, and how far a mother will go to defend what's right. there are scars that never fade. I still miss his laugh, his phone calls, his way of making every ordinary day feel important. But now, when I close my eyes, I see him smiling, not in tragedy, but in peace. I like to think he knows justice was done, and that I kept my promise. If there's anything I've learned, it's to trust your instincts and never let fear silence you. Truth may take time, but it always finds its way to the light. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever faced betrayal or loss and found the strength to stand again, share your experience below. Sometimes, our stories are what remind others that healing is possible and that love never really dies.